Greetings, citizens of Nerdtropolis. Sean Taj here, the mayor of Nerdtropolis, and my guest today is wrestling legend Chris Jericho, who is the executive producer of the Death Tour. Chris Jericho, what an extreme pleasure.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
No, thank you for the opportunity to chat with you. I had the privilege to meet you a couple of times. I even had you sign my Wrestlemania 17 magazine, which I attended in the historical Astrodome when I was just 11 years old. So that keeps close to me. Wow. It was such a memorable experience.
Very cool.
First off, though, do you remember that WrestleMania where you were pitted against William Regal for the Intercontinental Championships? Anything stick out to you from being in the Astrodome?
I just remember it was a huge show, and anytime you can kick off a WrestleMania, it's always a big responsibility. And I just remember the match was very short, but I remember it went fairly well.
Yeah, exciting times for my inner 11-year-old. I loved it. But we're here to talk about the Death Tour, a documentary that you're executive producer of, and I must say, what a special story that spotlights different journeys of different wrestlers. Something I didn't know about before. I learned a lot from this, and I love that everyone's showing their vulnerable side in this documentary and highlights the trauma, redemption, and the passion of wrestling. This is extremely very interesting. Can you explain to everyone out there what exactly the Death Tour is?
Well, I mean, I think you kind of explained it a lot in what you just said, and that there's a lot of wrestling fans that don't think about how to get to the top level. You know, there's a lot of people that watch the shows and watch Dynamite or watch Raw and go, wow, this is huge. And there's these guys are making millions of dollars and they're famous and so many fans, which is great if you get to that position, but there's such a ladder to climb to get there. And the Death Tour in Canada, Western Canada more specifically, is one of those ways to get your name out there and get a little bit of a foothold, because it's got such notoriety that if you can do a Death Tour and survive it and thrive from it, it'll help you kind of claw your way up that ladder a little bit. There's a lot of people in those tours you'll never see again, but you never know who might come through to become, a main eventer like Chris Jericho or Adam Copeland or Christian or Don Callis or Kenny Omega. Any of these guys, all of us went through a Death Tour, and all of us experienced just how hard the pro wrestling business can be, because I don't think there's a harder tour that you can ever have in this business than the Death Tour. And that's why it's named. No one is literally dying, but I think dreams can die on this tour when you realize just how hard it is to really commit to doing this job if you're not completely mentally 100% into it.
Yeah, it seems like your mentality is tested, and what a grueling landscape as well. Being in Texas, seeing stuff like that, all that snow, and just being in the looks like complete wilderness is, man, that's a lot to deal with. Yeah, it is wild. And you've done this twice?
I just did one Death Tour right during the beginning of my career. But once again, I've worked for Tony Condello so many times. Like, Tony's promoted shows at all times of the year in all areas. And I was actually thankful that I was working enough at the time in Mexico and in Japan that every year there was a Death Tour. I didn't have to worry about even trying to get on it because I was overseas working somewhere. But if I didn't have those gigs, damn well I would have been on a Death Tour, because you got to stay working. And that's why, like I mentioned, all those names of the guys that have done them, February comes around, March comes around. If you're not booked anywhere, you try and get booked on the Death Tour, and it's going to be hard, but you got to work, and that's the passion. Like, people will come to this tour knowing how hard it is because they want to be involved in the business so badly.
What do you remember most from being on that tour?
Well, mine was a summer tour. So like I said, that could be the sequel to the Death Tour, because all the trials and tribulations that you have in the winter, you obviously don't have in the summer, but there's a whole myriad of new challenges that open up, as far as, you travel across the frozen lakes almost as a shortcut to get to the different reservations. When those frozen lakes are unfrozen, you have to drive around them on really bad dirt roads. And that takes so much more time. And then you got mosquitoes are terrible. And there's just so much of a different elemental focus on the one that I did. But the winter ones are probably worse, because no one's ever, well, I guess they have died from being too hot, but I think it happens a lot worse from people dying from being too cold and from actually, crushing through the ice in the vans. We couldn't do that because there was no ice to drive on.
Yeah, seeing them, stuck in the snow, I couldn't deal with that. But the whole time I watched this documentary, I kept noticing how much fun all the kids were having and how excited, and, reminded myself of, how I fell in love with wrestling at a very young age. And it served as a reminder of the importance and impact of being a role model, especially as a wrestler. And you mentioned Tony Condello, the founder of the International Wrestling Alliance, and he uses this tour kind of to speak with kids at the same time. And I love his messaging and his like zero tolerance policy for drugs and alcohol. Can you talk about the first time you met Tony?
Well, Tony's one of those legendary figures in Canadian pro wrestling. And he's been involved in the business since the 60s, maybe even the 50s. You can't get anything past Tony because he's seen it all and he's done it all. But once again, if you're a young Canadian wrestler, you're going to work for Tony Condello because there's not a lot of options. And he's the guy that's kind of one of the gatekeepers to having people know who you are. And there's so many guys, all of my guys, all my peers and my friends from Canada work with Tony. I mean, that's how Don Callis and I got so close, and Dr. Luther and Lance Storm, like, not to mention all the others, Adam Copeland and Christian, but I'm talking those guys that I'm just mentioned. We were always touring together with Tony in the summer, in the winter, wherever it may be, because, once again, if you're a Canadian wrestler and you want to work, Tony's one of the guys that would give you work. And I think all of us owe something to Tony because he did give us all a chance when we were so young. And when you're young, you got to get the reps, and not just in the ring, but traveling around and driving in little hotels and cheap hotels and 4 guys to a room and 6 guys to a room and working in front of 40 people, but also working in front of 400 people. And at the end of the night, going to the local bar where they let you in the front of the line because you're the wrestlers in town. Like at that time, that's might as well be, the main event of WrestleMania. And that's one thing you mentioned about these kids freaking out over our talent on the death tour. When you go to Bloodvein or Woboden up in northern Manitoba, these reservations, there is no AEW, there is no WWE. So when you come to town, you are the equivalent of John Moxley or John Cena or the top star. And that's why you can see the reactions of these kids to the matriarch, to Sage, for example, or how much they love, Dez. Or the Dez in our movie, I don't think he's ever had a match in his life. I think he had some played wrestling up in, the Inuit or whatever, Northwest Territories. But, he's getting a chance to be a hero. Everyone can be a hero just for one day, as Bowie said. In this case, it's just for 3 weeks. And those kids respond to you that way.
Yeah, one of the many shining moments in this documentary, especially seeing the kids, just their eyes light up so big. Lastly, what advice would you give to aspiring wrestlers considering such a challenging path?
Do all of those types of matches that you can do. Do a death tour. Track Tony Condello down and send him he probably still wants you to send him a picture and a videotape. That's how we used to do it. But send him your link, because one of these tours, it will push you, but it will teach you so many lessons, not just about wrestling, but about life. And you'll be able to prove to yourself if you really want to do this, because if you don't want to do this, you're not going to want to travel 16 hours in a cramped up, freezing van across a frozen lake to get to a high school gymnasium in the middle of nowhere, set up the ring, wrestle the match, take the ring down, put your sleeping bag on a gym floor, and eat a ham sandwich for $30 when you're getting paid probably $50 for the night. And that's just how it is. So either you do it and you take the benefits of it, or you just look at the reasons why you don't want to do it and pack up your stuff and never get involved in wrestling again.
Great insight from the one and only Chris Jericho. Thank you so much. And hopefully our paths cross again.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks a lot, dude.
Once again, this is Sean Taj, the mayor of Nerdtropolis, and stay tuned for more movie news, reviews, interviews, and trailers.